because that history has an ability to shape my future. If then we had activists, we need to begin to ask ourselves, where are they now? Those that were massacred at Sharpeville, where are they now? Don't we have an ability to reproduce? Don't we have an ability to self-recreate? Those instances are important reminders. They are the ones that have placed us where we are and given us the responsibility that we're sitting with. And in my view, as a collective, we can be able to say we dare not fail them. They made ultimate sacrifices. Then what will be the price of our sacrifices? Let me then give or hand over to my colleagues so that they can see what they can say.
Greetings, everyone. I think all questions have been covered by me. For example, look at what was happening by that time. That period of, for example, state of emergency was period which the TRC was looking at. And you can see in the reports of the commission, the remarks that, or the findings that were made against certain institutions and certain individuals, such as medical practitioners, prosecutors of that time, not us, magistrates of that time. Yeah, so it was actually highlighting how the system was working, that everybody was actually involved. You can hear from previous speakers, Dr. Nzele, when he was highlighting how Dr. Luthuli was actually treated and why he was not transferred to other hospitals. It was the system that was working in that fashion. So he had not to be transferred to Durban because he was going to get the assistance, and perhaps he was going to be treated at that particular time. But mainly at that particular time, the system caused a black man to be an enemy of another black man. You will remember the starting point of the TRC, how it started. It was started by the man that assassinated Mxenge. It was an African man, but he was used. That's how the system was working. It was causing us to be divided and become the enemies of each other. Or rather, the finding that for the matter to go to court, a thorough investigation has to be conducted and a decision has to be made by the NPA, whether you prosecute or whether you take the matter to the inquest. That is why there was this inquest of Chief Albert Luthuli, who passed away when my mother was 5 years old. Thank you.
I'm alerted that in the first question there was a question. There was a second part of the question whether we would propose or how we would redraft the legislation to cater for any lacuna that may exist in how we implement it and how it is used today. What we have done within the NPA, we've used the existing legislation. In our view, the Inquest Act is capable of an interpretation that allows for it to cater for issues which are not specifically and expressly mentioned therein. And you probably would hear in the next few weeks of what we are doing with that in KwaZulu-Natal, with some of the cases that we're dealing with, trying to have the courts interpret our law in line with our constitution in order to achieve justice as demanded by the constitution of our country. And we believe that we can do that. It's a possibility, and we should be able to work within this current existing legal framework. Yeah, so I think that in part answers your questions.
Okay. Ms. Trini, any last thoughts? One thing is for sure, when I joined this unit, oblivious. Yes, we were taught in high school about the history of our country. However, we were not taught about exactly what it is that our country went through. There was a speaker previously, I think it was the first speaker, Professor Webb, when he highlighted oral history and when he highlighted what it means to feel the history, not just to be told the history. And I'm a young, well, maybe I might not look that young, but I am young. In the sense that I did not live through apartheid. My parents lived through apartheid, but I did not. And through this work, one had an opportunity to understand exactly what it is that our people went through. And I think if I can be given an opportunity to address the youth and to address those who are of my age, we are extremely fortunate to be living within a democratic country where we have freedom of expression, where we are not subjected to, or where we actually are not gagged, let me put it that way. We are extremely fortunate. We have got freedoms, we have rights, we have a Bill of Rights that we can enforce. Human rights are recognized within the constitutional dispensation. And that is something that our parents, our grandparents, Chief Luthuli in particular, did not experience. Many cadres died for us to be where we are today. I believe there is going to be a speaker that Mr. Kachi, who elaborate him and many others who went through that kind of suffering for us to be where we are today. So let us acknowledge our heroes and heroines. Let us be grateful. Yes, things are not perfect within our country, but let us be grateful and let us acknowledge them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Advocate Chweni. Thank you so much, all the colleagues from the NPA. I think I speak on behalf of all of us that we appreciate the work that you do. We see the work that you do for justice for all of us in this country. And we are honored that you took the time from your very busy schedule to be with us today, because you also deemed it important that you be part of this conversation so that we can also even learn beyond what we see on television or what we read in articles, but to actually get firsthand accounts of the work that you do and how you go about doing your work. So we really, really appreciate you and the work that you do. Ladies and gentlemen, as I've said, because of the important work that they do, they came all the way from KZN and they have to go back so that they can continue with this important work. And so before we then release them, I would like to invite the chairperson of the Luthuli Museum, Advocate Naidu, together with the executive dean of our College here of Human Sciences, to assist me in thanking our colleagues. Yes. Maybe one can be this side. Plus you're matching with your outfit. And on the other side. On the other side of them. Yeah. Okay. So colleagues from the NPA, on behalf of the College of Human Sciences here at UNISA and on behalf of the Luthuli Museum, we would like to give you these tokens of appreciation as a way of saying thank you for being here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, let's please give them a round of applause. And thank you, colleagues. You may take your seats. They'll still be here for another few minutes, but at some point they will disappear. So we just wanted to acknowledge them before they do. Siyabonga. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving to our next speaker of the day, Dr. Sandiswa Lerato Kobe. She is one of our foremost emerging scholars here at the University of South Africa in the field of Black theology, African spirituality, and Ubuntu, with interest on the truth and reconciliation Commission in 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, without wasting any more time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kobe.
Thank you so much, Prof. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking after this panel, I'm just reminded that in my thesis, I actually, in master's, tried to look at the CRADOC 4 and how complicated the case is. I abandoned it. and I decided to stick with the PEPCO 3 and the massacre, St. James massacre, and the Guguletu 7. That was my work on my master's. And I'm saying this context that also there is an inquest into that. Yeah. My presentation today is titled Transitional Justice and the Unfinished Work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I will try to make the time, though it's going to be difficult. So I have about maybe 6 points that I want to speak into if I don't finish it. First one is historical context in which the Chief Albert Luthuli emerges as a leader. And then the recent inquest to the death of Chief Albert Luthuli as a hermeneutic of suspicion into the Black South African archive in South Africa. The third point is transitional justice. And the fourth point is Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the fifth point is a Black theology account into the work of the TRC of South Africa. And then the sixth point is reconciliation as an unfinished business and its material consequences for impoverished indigenous Black South Africans. Those are the points I would like to speak to. The church in South Africa was never a united institution because it reflected the different cultures, traditions, and spiritualities of those who established it. Many churches are still shaped by European missionary tradition. Despite colonial origins, the English-speaking churches, of course, like the Anglican Church, Methodist Church, Presbyterian Church, and congregational churches, Black leaders have tried to represent the cultures of the African people. And of course, these Black church leaders include Inkosi Albert Luthuli and Zen-K Matthews and others. Albert Luthuli, as a church leader, rejected a racial discrimination as an un-Christian and advocated equality, human dignity, and justice for all in South Africa. This commitment was expressed at the 1949 Rosettville Conference, where church leaders affirmed that all people are created in the image of God and therefore deserve equal rights, education, political participation, and opportunities. Chief Albert Luthuli played a significant role at this conference, challenging racial exclusivity and the belief civilization belonged only to white people. It is from this context in which we must understand Chief Albert Luthuli's legacy. We must place him in the archives within the broader context of colonialism, land dispossession, apartheid, and Western Christianity in South Africa. More than politicking, it is important that the Chief Albert Luthuli is memorized and remembered as a community leader who transformed the ANC into a mass-based liberation movement. Chief Albert Luthuli remained deeply connected to the struggles of ordinary people in Grootville and became a symbol of justice, dignity, and resistance against oppression, not just in society, but also within the institutions like church. In the recent inquest, I am of the opinion that the inquest into the death of Chief Albert Luthuli is far more than correcting a historical mistake. It represents a long-awaited opportunity for the Luthuli family to uncover truth about what happened to their son, father, grandfather, and to finally achieve a sense of accountability, respect, and dignity. The ruling that indeed the Chief Albert Luthuli was murdered highlights the desire of our ancestors for both truth-telling and justice. Belele nje basathetha. They want the historical record corrected, the myths surrounding the Chief Albert Luthuli exposed, and the full circumstances of his death made known to the public. The family has also made it clear that truth alone is not enough. They expect those responsible to be identified, prosecuted, and held accountable for their actions. For them, justice requires consequences as well as reparation for the harm caused. Their refusal to accept the apartheid era explanation that Chief Albert Luthuli, a capable and respected leader, was simply struck by a goods train reflects a broader rejection of the false narratives that have often been used to conceal the realities of colonial and apartheid violence. The inquest, therefore, represents an important step towards restoring truth, dignity, and justice for the Luthuli family, Izinyanya, and South Africa as a whole. It is a call to read the archive against the grain. South Africa's transitional justice model is often praised internationally as an example of how societies can move beyond gross human rights violation and build democracy. Rather than pursuing a victor's justice approach like the Nuremberg trials, South Africa's leaders and negotiated settlements and the National Party through CODESA. Leaders such as Nelson F.W. de Klerk and Desmond Tutu are inspired, balancing justice for past abuses with reconciliation and nation building. As a result, the focus has shifted from punishing perpetrators to promoting restorative justice, where victims, perpetrators, and beneficiaries of apartheid were encouraged to participate in rebuilding. Emerged as a central mechanism of transitional justice, prioritizing truth-telling, restorative justice. The was mandated to invest gross human rights violation committed in 1960 and 1994, including adoption, killing, retaliation, and Ubuntu rather than victimization. He asserted that this idea of restorative justice was drawn on traditional African jurisprudence. The commission aimed to heal bridges, redress imbalances, restore broken relationship, and rehabilitate both victims and perpetrators so they could reintegrate into South African society. A point that is challenged by Ubuntu scholars today, like Mogobe Ramose and Dumiso Dlada, and to include myself in those scholars. To this fact, when we engage the TRC, we must remember that Tutu viewed reconciliation and forgiveness as central to the TRC process. He then linked forgiveness to Ubuntu and produced his own assertion of what restorative justice means. Forgiveness was not part of the TRC of South Africa. So therefore, Tutu had said it, and he linked this forgiveness, this Christian forgiveness into Ubuntu. And this is restorative justice. Must remember, when we take on the archive of the TRC, that forgiveness was not part of the TRC mandate. To this point, scholars like Mahmoud Mamdani and Maluleke argue that the nation of South Africa's transition and the TRC were flawed from the beginning. They contend that the emphasis on reconciliation, individual amnesty, over who is one of the leading scholars of Black theology globally, points out that Desmond Tutu and church leaders played a central role in promoting the South African miracle, while failing to adequately address structural injustices created by colonialism and apartheid. His argument is that reconciliation has long been an instrument of church. Churches promoted as a solution to social conflict, often without addressing deeper questions of dispossession, economic equality, and Black liberation. Luthuli also was in 1949, organized by the church. So in post-1994 South Africa, forgiveness and reconciliation and Ubuntu became dominant national ideas associated with leaders such as Desmond Tutu. There was now, it seems, an inclusion of indigenous people's bodies, but also like Ubuntu to end Black South Africans to accept continued inequalities while preserving existing economic structures. Therefore, before 19 done through the church, and it was always white scholars and white theologians who were promoting this, but post-1994, we see Black becoming part of this. The Rustenburg Conference of 1990 must be archived as a turning point where Tutu's partial forgiveness towards white churches symbolized the shift from nation-centered to spirituality. Tutu moved away from the cultural Black theology and began speaking primarily as a leader committed to negotiations and books and articles to the we must archive that. Mamdani critiqued the narrow understanding of human rights by individual torture and abduction, failing to recognize apartheid itself as against humanity. Focusing on individual victims and perpetrators, the TRC treated apartheid largely as a context rather than as a central violation. Structural injustices such as forced laws, past laws, racial segregation, land dispossession, and institutionalized racism were not given the same recognition as individual acts of violence. As a result, the TRC promoted national reconciliation without fully confronting apartheid as a system of organized racial oppression. Mamdani asserts that reconciliation cannot be meaningful without acknowledging the collective suffering of Black communities and the structural nature of apartheid. The Commission's emphasis on individual stories obscured broader questions of racial and economic injustices. Maluleke and Mamdani agreed that while the goal of national healing was noble, but provided uncertainty to pay and limited reparation. And morality of the TRC were built on Western Christian notions of truth, forgiveness, and reconciliation that did not sufficiently address the economic realities of the poor, particularly Black, like your AIC is in this conversation, how reconciliation must look like. The TRC did not allow victims to tell their full stories, filtered through legal procedures and statements, meaning that many experiences were edited or restricted. Victims often lacked the resources to challenge amnesty applications, while perpetrators could secure amnesty through claims of full disclosure. Consequently, the TRC revealed only part of the truth, leaving many stories untold. In case in point, the disappearance of the death and the young man Mpemu Mnyandu, who delivered the letter to Chief Albert Luthuli. His story remains forgotten until the recent inquest by the family of Chief Albert Luthuli. Concealed truth about the past. Maluleke further argues that they adopted concepts from Black theology of liberation and humanist feminist theology and spiritualities. It stripped them of their liberatory content. Ideas such as justice, reconciliation, Ubuntu, solidarity, and non-racialism remained, but their meaning were altered. In this view, the TRC theology encouraged victims to forgive and avoid bitterness while placing little pressure on perpetrators to demonstrate meaningful repentance or provide material restitution. As the new generation journeying into the past, we must question the moral authority of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. Their powerful examples of forgiveness and reconciliation became national ideals that left little room for anger, resistance for deeper justice. Those who continue to challenge inequality, racism, and economic exclusion are often dismissed as resentful or trapped in the past. In the case of Martha Nussbaum's book, Anger and Forgiveness, published in 2017. We must acknowledge that this moral framework limits discussion about reparation, restitution, and structural transformation. This perspective acknowledges that prioritizing reconciliation over justice and focused on individual acts of violence rather than apartheid as a system of racial domination by promoting forgiveness, Ubuntu, and national unity without adequately addressing structural inequality, land dispossession, and economic justice. The TRC obscured the full reality of apartheid as a crime against humanity. The central question remains whether the emphasis on reconciliation of forgiveness helped South Africa move forward, or whether it left deeper South Africa often criticized or marginalized. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, for example, faced significant criticism for insisting that political freedom had to be accompanied by economic justice. Likewise, women such as Mrs. Konile, who appeared before the Truth Reconciliation Commission, were often portrayed as irrational and mad when they demanded recognition of their humanity and dignity before they could consider forgiveness, reconciliation, or Ubuntu towards those responsible for the death of their loved ones. Drawing on Tendai's Tole's critique of post-1994, it can be argued that the dominant post-1994 narrative of the Rainbow Nation was largely shaped by political and social elites. While democracy Black people were responsible for apartheid. Tutu's emphasis on forgiveness encouraged South Africans to move forward together, but it also contributed to a situation in which demands for justice, restitution, redress were repeatedly postponed. Ubuntu became increasingly associated with acceptance, forgiveness, and coexistence, even in circumstances where the underlying causes of injustice remain unaddressed. Currently, Ubuntu in South Africa is in need of Ubuntu. Those are the words of Alan Busak. As scholars, we must acknowledge that the effects of a pseudo Ubuntu forgiveness and reconciliation are visible in contemporary South Africa. Many poor communities continue to face unemployment, inadequate housing, poor healthcare services, and deteriorating living conditions. Concerns about undocumented migration, pressures of township infrastructure, and economic insecurities are connected to broader frustrations about the unfulfilled promises of democracy. We must confess that labor struggles such as the 2012 mine workers' protest that led to the Marikana massacre exposed the continuing exploitation of Black South African workers. Black South Africans live in conditions characterized by poor sanitation, overcrowding, and inadequate access to basic service in democratic South Africa. There must be truth-telling that protests for minimum wage have become silent in context characterized by mass migration. South Africa is experiencing and witnessing a struggle for employment amongst the poor in South Africa. Though it used to be the fight of minimum wage, now it's a fight to get actually the job. Black South Africans live similarly. Student movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, and End Outsourcing challenged the failure of post-1994 South African institutions. These movements highlighted the continued barriers to quality education, skills development, and employment opportunities. Together, these struggles demonstrate that many of the demands raised during the anti-apartheid struggle remain unresolved, particularly those relating to equality, dignity, and economic justice. Despite these realities, we must admit that the concerns of the indigenous Black poor are often dismissed by political elites, sections of civil academics, and middle class. Instead, there is frequently an expectation that poor communities should prioritize unity, conciliation. Our government should prioritize African solidarity. They are often promoted without addressing immediate material challenges facing those who continue to experience poverty and exclusion since the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in South Africa. While it is the right of the government policies to emphasize the cooperation of Pan-African and regional responsibility, particularly in relation to migration, this focus exists alongside affecting land. 7% in 1994. Now, Black Africans only own 3%. Resources distribution and economic transformation and reparations remain only partially addressed. As a result, many communities perceive growing gap between political rhetoric and their lived experience. This situation, therefore, creates the impression that urgent domestic questions of redistribution and justice are being overshadowed by broader political and economic agendas of the elites. Consequently, many historical disadvantaged communities feel abandoned by democratic. Persistent poverty, unemployment, and inequality reinforce the belief that the promises of liberation have not been yet fulfilled. To conclude this section here, because I don't have time, I want to read here from Ndumiso Dladla. Ndumiso Dladla argues that the violence of apartheid and colonial wars of conquest produced a sustained. I'm thinking of time. The violence of apartheid and colonial wars of conquest produced and sustained the dispossession of Black indigenous people in South Africa, stripping them of their land, cattle, and means of livelihood. This encounter dismantles Ubuntu-based society and in doing so undermine the condition necessary for the embodiment of Ubuntu. According to Dladla, this ethical assessment stems from the historical experience of injustices manifested in three interconnected forms. First, the so-called right to conquest, which involved the unjust and illegitimate seizure of sovereign authority and territory from Abantu to Abelungu. Secondly, political speeches that facilitate ongoing systems of economic exploitation. Thirdly, racism, which serves as an entrenchment, to political subjugation and sustain economic oppression of indigenous people of South Africa, until we actively confront and transform this history by challenging its enduring consequences. True Ubuntu remains in need of Ubuntu. Only through corrections of historical injustices and the rectification of archival record can South Africa be meaningfully regarded as an Ubuntu society by Abantu people of South Africa. In conclusion, the current South Africa's agenda of reconciliation, truth-telling, solidarity without meaningful restitution and justice allows structural inequalities and structural injustice to remain intact, and in many cases, they normalize ongoing Black suffering in the name of reconciliation and unity. The opening of the inquest into the death of Inkosi Albert Luthuli is significant because it challenges official apartheid era accounts and reopens important questions about truth, accountability, memory, and justice. More than correcting the historical record, it highlights the limitation of South Africa's transition and raises difficult questions about whether reconciliation alone was sufficient to address the legacy of apartheid. Ultimately, reconciliation without substantive justice, restitution, contributes to a political culture in which inequality persists, Black agency is constrained, and Ubuntu is often interpreted in ways that sustain rather than challenge injustices. For this reason, there is a continuing need for Black scholars to engage with questions of power, justice, reconciliation, and liberation. Human rights activists, church leaders, and politicians must critically examine narratives of peace and unity that had been achieved. In my view, the outcome of the Chief Albert Luthuli inquest offers renewed hope that we may bring reconciliation, so in truth, accountability, dignity, and genuine justice for all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kobe. Once again, we have been given a lot to think about and to reflect on. And I'm going to again invite us to offer our comments, our reflections, our questions following the presentation that you've just heard. Yes, we have one. Okay, I see you. There's two. And three. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Kobe, for that amazing presentation. There has been a recurring tendency when looking at the TRC reports in retrospect that is very apparent that the aspects of justice in the TRC reports still is absent. And I encountered that in my own PhD thesis when I was relooking at Solomon Mahlangu's case, that even in the aspect of justice, when they had to consider what happened in the court, the TRC to prove the consequence reconciliation And sit down, I don't know where I wrote it, but the aspect of bringing people together and singing Kumbaya and looking good in front of the international community. How do we then aspect of the courts, and how still even today there's an elephant in the room. The court system, it was almost like it was put at the back burner, that once we challenge how the courts processed individuals, articulated cases where justice was supposedly discussed, we still haven't thoroughly looked at how the courts treated individuals like freedom fighters, etc. I don't know if I'm being clear, but I think you get
She says
my
she
gist.
gets it.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
And then we move on to the second question.
Thank you, and greetings to everyone and protocol observed. I'd like to develop a question. I'm not one to do two-part questions because I could tell that the speaker obviously had a lot on her mind today, and obviously, unfortunately for her, she was very much constrained by time. You spoke of a colonial and apartheid violence. I found that to be quite interesting because amongst the many things we've forgotten about Inkosi, Luthuli, is that he led, and to the point of one of the audience members on their questions, during two eras. He led both during the colonial